Hello and welcome to SAM Conversations. I'm Nandni Mahajan. In this episode, we will look at the current developments in Afghanistan and what the future holds for the war-ravaged country. Today, we have with us Commodore Bhaskar, who is the Director, Society for Policy Studies, and one of India's leading experts on security and strategic affairs. Needless to say, he's been following the current crisis in Afghanistan very closely. In this conversation, we'll be looking at multiple domains and issues, ranging from the regional politics to domestic politics shaping Kabul, what are the US and NATO arms and ammunitions, and what are the potential implications for India. Welcome to the conversation, Mr. Bhaskar.
Thank you, Nandini.
So, Mr. Bhaskar, what do you make of the human tragedy in the country?
If we look at Afghanistan just now, it's a little over a week since the sudden takeover by the Taliban on Sunday last, the 15th of August. I think this is a human tragedy that is still unfolding. And the reason I'm saying this is not just because of the visuals that we have seen for the last week as they have emerged from Kabul, but the various reports that are also coming in from other parts of this country. And the tragedy really is driven by the uncertainty, the anxiety. Now, one way of looking at tragedy is to say the number of people killed inadvertently, perhaps because of the stampede, the chaos at the airport. That number looks small. But behind that, I think if you look at the Afghan citizen, those who are trying to flee the country, those who are not able to leave the country, though they would like to, and those in other parts of Afghanistan outside of Kabul, who are living in a state of considerable anxiety, uncertainty, because they do not quite know what the Taliban is all about, especially when it comes into power. Because if you recall, you may not recall because this is well before your time, but the Taliban had seized power the first time around in September 1996. And for 5 years, they were, quote unquote, ruling Afghanistan. And it was very brutal. It was very repressive. They ostensibly were trying to impose an interpretation of the Islamic Sharia law, which in many ways was extreme in terms of how it was dealing with the citizens and even the symbols of modernity, whether we talk about the younger demography, people going to watch films, listen to music, children going to school, particularly girls, all of this was brought under a completely, I would say, draconian and a very restrictive kind of framework. And in those 5 years, amongst the many excesses was the kind of orientation towards the world. Now, apart from Al-Qaeda, Bin Laden, which is one association of the Taliban and what they did, the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas, the attacks on the minorities, and the entire, I would say, interpretation of the Islamic Sharia law along this very hard and extreme medieval interpretation almost of one school, the Sunni-dominated school, I think brought a lot of grief at that time to the citizens of Afghanistan. So from there to now, of late, there's been a kind of interpretation talking about Taliban 1.0, 1996, and Taliban 2.0, which is 2021. I have also used that kind of a template to refer to the current seizure of power by the Taliban. But my reading is that their ideology, what they subscribe to, what they believe in terms of how they want to administer, how they want to govern Afghanistan. There is no change in the software. There is no change in the ideology, not that one can really discern. It's too early. There's a lot of flux. There's a lot of turbulence. So that's my real anxiety, that it is the way in which I think most citizens of Afghanistan are very concerned about the future. And that, to my mind, is the real tragedy, because then, of course, it pans out into different strands: education, health, economy, infrastructure, all the things that young Afghanistan is aspiring for? I think that's a big question. Nandini?
Yes, no, I absolutely agree with you. And, it's quite disheartening because, you've had so many international players in Afghanistan for a very long time. And the way the Taliban has, gone on to capture major cities and pretty much all of Afghanistan at this moment is too fast-paced. What are your thoughts on that? Like, how can the work of decades be undone in such a short period of time?
This has become a huge puzzle because, as you say, decades of investment in Afghanistan, literally 20 years from 9/11, which is September 2001 to where we are now. And the amount of money that's been invested into Afghanistan by the United States, the NATO allies, and other donor countries, including India, by the way, which had a fairly large footprint in the development sector. All of that now is currently, shall we say, either on hold, or there is anxiety that it could also be reversed. For instance, education, particularly for young children. Will they follow the same pattern, or will they go back to a different kind of an education system which will prioritize the boys and have a completely different kind of curriculum that would conform to the Islamic tenets of how education is to be imparted? What about the girl child? The Malala symbol, if you will, will the other young Malalas of Afghanistan be allowed to go to school? Will all the women who were part of the workforce till recently, who had a certain aspiration about contributing to not only Afghanistan, but enriching their own lives in terms of growth, whichever sector they were working in, would they be allowed to continue? So I think all of this, apart from the money, the United States says that some estimates talk about $2 trillion. I mean, that is a huge sum. If you can imagine $2 trillion, it's, something that can be compared to India's annual GDP. That's the kind of figure we're talking about. The Afghanistan National Security Forces, the army and the police and so on, are supposed to have received upwards of $80 to $90 billion for training and inventory. So the question uppermost is, why did this entire edifice collapse so quickly? Not a bullet seems to have been fired to stop the Taliban. Now, part of the reason is that, again, I'm reconstructing recent events. One is the empirical reality that the Taliban had entered into a deal with the Trump administration, if you remember, which is before Mr. Biden took over. And they had set up certain dates about when US forces would leave. So in many ways, Mr. Biden as president inherited a certain agreement. So the first question that comes to my mind as an analyst is, after all, there were many policies of President Trump that President Biden had reversed. For instance, the United States and climate change, the United States and NATO, so on and so forth. So, as I said, to me, the first logical question was that, why did he not get into a huddle with his advisors and say, can we reopen the negotiations with the Taliban and say that this date of mid-2021, whether it is July or August or September, is not advisable, and we might get more time and then have a more planned exit? That's the first question. It did not happen. Then there was a lot of toing and froing, and suddenly goalposts were changed, and they said that by September 11, 2021, which is the anniversary, the 20th anniversary of 9/11, the United States would leave. And apparently the Taliban said that till that point, they would not attack any American assets or NATO assets. But after that day, it would be a free-for-all. We don't know how much of this is accurate, but you can see a certain pattern of events. And very suddenly, this is where I believe was a huge, to my mind, again, tactical policy error, which is that the United States decided to leave the Bagram Air Base. If you look at the topography, geography of Afghanistan, Bagram was a very important air base for the entire effort, the entire global war on terror for the US and its allies. Now, the way in which the US decided to leave Bagram was very sudden. It was almost by stealth. They did not even inform the local Afghan leadership. And that was, I think, a big disappointment, because the reason is also tactical. That without air cover, without air support, the Afghan security forces did not have the kind of credibility that they otherwise did. Because many of the Afghan army, Afghan security force operations were enabled by the air power that the United States could provide, both in terms of surveillance and ordnance. That did not happen. And therefore, I think the Taliban became more emboldened, that in a way they were dealing with an enfeebled Afghan national army. And the last point, Nandini, which I think was also part of the reason, is that maybe the Afghan security forces felt completely demotivated. Because if you look at the politics of the Ghani government, President Ashraf Ghani, who actually fled the country, there was again a lot of turbulence, a lot of mistrust. Senior ministers were changed overnight, intelligence chiefs. The entire thing was, I would say, very, very sad for the Afghan security forces. They were not quite sure what they were fighting for. And then the leadership, you can't have a dispirited army being led into battle by a leadership that is not very convinced about why they are going into war. And will they actually shed blood or lay their lives down? That's a big question mark. Because Afghanistan's own domestic or internal strategic culture is that they rarely go into intense war when they are fighting among themselves. They normally strike deals, they barter, they exchange money, and they have compromises between the warlords. Afghanistan becomes one when there is a foreign invader. It happened when the Soviets invaded in the late 70s. It happened when the US did 9/11. So there is an element of strategic culture also. And I think personally that as far as the Afghan security forces, their leadership, and the entire, I would say, infrastructure was very, very disheartened when in the last stages, instead of having sustained negotiations, the so-called transfer of power, the United States decided to exit. President Ghani decided to flee, and therefore there was absolutely no leadership, and the army melted. And the Taliban, I'm told now, when you look at the interview, they themselves were surprised at the speed with which Kabul fell. So I think many factors combined to lead to this sudden fall of Kabul. Nandini?
Yes. Well, my next question is going to be about, Taliban is not, operating on its own. Of course, it's getting some sort of support from somewhere. So what do you think is the role being played by, other South Asian countries like Pakistan and China?
Well, clearly, I think you can see the Pakistani footprint or paws all over this Taliban takeover of Kabul. Because the way in which I think the entire thing was planned seemed to suggest that there was a certain external advisor to the Taliban. And this is no surprise again, because after all, the ISI has played a very major role in shaping and actually training the Taliban and certain factions. So I think that's the first. And the second is the China factor, because once the United States had made the announcement to leave, I think you could see a certain space that had been created, a geopolitical space. And clearly, China was also positioning itself because of its larger game plan or agenda for the region, which is the Belt and Road Initiative, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. And in this, I think we should also look at the way in which Russia and China have a correspondence of interests. So I think all of them, and even in the last 10 days since the Taliban has taken over, you can see that at the moment, the most empathetic, sympathetic kind of signals are coming from these three countries, which is Pakistan, China, and Russia. And concurrently, there are other players. In the region, there is Iran, which has a certain locus vis-a-vis Afghanistan. And the 5 Central Asian states, amongst them, those which are proximate to Afghanistan, the neighbors, Tajik, has a very significant role to play. So do the Uzbeks. So I think they also are relevant. And across the region, you find Turkey and Qatar, have also played a role in the shaping of the geopolitics. And they all have interests. And this, I think, is again something we need to wait and watch, because at the moment, it is not as if the Taliban is a cohesive unit. with a single command and control and a hierarchy. They are a loosely knit kind of cluster of different groups. And among them, I want to circle back to Pakistan, is the Haqqani group. We in India are familiar with the Haqqani. It is a terror organization. It has had a hand in many attacks that were directed against India in Afghanistan, including the embassy. And it has been seen as, again, a proxy for the Pakistani interest in Afghanistan. So this, I think, is something that is also going to play out, because clearly, again, some of the reports seem to suggest that China has also backed or supported one of the clusters within the Taliban. And there is also a certain ethnic composition within the Taliban and its Pashtun base. They are not one single unit. So I think this is the kind of domestic politics that we will have to see. How do they decide the division of power? And how will the provinces be administered? Because Afghanistan is a large geography. Kabul is the capital. It has a large population. But at the end of the day, for the economy, for the agriculture, and by the way, the big question mark is narcotics, the drugs trade. Yeah. That has been a major revenue stream for Afghanistan traditionally, ever since opium has become a major crop. So all these, I think, at the moment are question marks. And frankly, my reading as an analyst is nobody knows, including the Taliban. Nandini?
Yes, well, that's very interesting. And, I would like to circle back and let's talk about India, right? And India's position in all of this. And you say that, Pakistan, China, and Russia, they all have their strategic interests in Afghanistan. And India, has tricky relations with both Pakistan and China, right? And what do you think India's next steps should be? Because India does have decent relationships with Russia. So what is your analysis of this?
That's very elegantly put. India has tricky relations with Pakistan, China, and Russia. That's the way you framed it. I would say it's more complex. And with both Pakistan and China and Russia, it's a very long, I would say, history of adversarial relationship with Pakistan and China for sure. And with Russia of late, there have been a few wrinkles. But my reading is that for India, there are multiple challenges. Some are related directly to the security of Indian interests and assets, even as we speak. There are a number of Indian citizens and assets. Most of them have come back, but they would have to be safeguarded. And for the long term, I think a Taliban in power in Afghanistan has not been good news for India. This happened in 96. We had the Kandahar hijacking of 1999. So our multi-layered challenge is going to be where the Haqqani is now part of the ruling cluster in Afghanistan, which is the face of the Taliban that we would be concerned about. The Taliban, in turn, could become a proxy for Pakistan. Pakistan, to my mind, is not going to give up its investment in terrorism very soon. Pakistan is a proxy for China. We have seen that in different ways, whether it is at the United Nations Security Council or dealing with regional issues and so on. And the United States has left. So all of this put together leads to a kind of, the word I'm using is orientation of the region and the ecosystem that is now sustaining these individual players and their interests. They do not augur positively for India. So I think India would have to now really do a strategic pause and monitor what is happening in Afghanistan. It's not as if we don't have strengths or assets. India has invested, we have a certain image, goodwill, and neither is the Taliban uniformly anti-India. So I think India has made a very strong statement at the United Nations Security Council. Our foreign minister, Dr. Jaishankar, had addressed the UNSC because India was holding the chair of the president. And certain, I think, lines have been indicated. We are hoping that there would be a global consensus about how to deal with the Taliban. But for now, I think India can really review its own options. But I've said this in the past, I'm saying it again. the image of India as a country that provides succor and help is something that we should, I think, remain invested in. Whether we are talking about Afghan citizens and students in particular who are currently in India, many of them are stranded, or those who are seeking some kind of, I would say, help from India, either within Afghanistan, the diaspora, I'm not sure how it will work out, but I think India needs to be able to live up to the trust that has been reposed in it by the citizens of Afghanistan. Nandini?
Yes, well, thank you so much, Mr. Bhaskar. And this is going to be my last question. And this is the question, probably to the entire world, because we've invested millions and trillions of dollars, like you said. So what is our responsibility to the Afghani people now, right?
Well, again, I think I would say that we should be visible. I think we should be able to signal to the Afghan people that we had entered Afghanistan with certain aspirations as to how we would, or objectives, let me not call it aspirations. India had objectives. The people of Afghanistan had an aspiration about democracy. I think at the end of the day, India should remain committed to the people of Afghanistan and encourage the Taliban, whatever be its dispensation in the months ahead, to become a stakeholder in the development of Afghanistan. Because that really, Nandini, is the ultimate challenge, I think, for the whole world. You can't wish the Taliban away. There is no military option. It's been tried for 20 years. So I think we have to see how the Taliban can be persuaded to take forward the aspirations of young Afghanistan, the children, the women, the girls, and all of those, I would say, that demography which wants to see a prosperous, stable Afghanistan in the next few decades.
Absolutely, absolutely right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Mr. Bhaskar. It has been an absolute pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.